The morning of December 7th, 1941, Lieutenant Commander Tyrell Jacobs stood in the control room of USS Drum, SS-228, one of the United States Navy's newly commissioned Gato-Class fleet submarines, as the vessel completed its final shakedown cruise off the coast of Connecticut. The boat rode smoothly through the Atlantic swells, its diesel engines thrumming with mechanical precision beneath the deck plates. Jacobs ran his hand along the cool steel of the Torpedo data computer, a device that would help his crew calculate firing solutions against Japanese merchant vessels and warships in the coming months. He did not yet know that within hours, the Japanese carrier strike force would attack Pearl Harbor, plunging America into a war for which the submarine force believed itself reasonably prepared. He did not know that Japanese naval intelligence had severely and systematically underestimated the combat persistence his submarine class could maintain during extended war patrols. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Gato-Class submarines represented the United States Navy's first truly mass-produced fleet submarine design, optimized for the vast distances of Pacific Ocean warfare. Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, and other shipyards would eventually construct 77 vessels of this class between 1941 and 1943, each boat measuring 311 feet in length, with a beam of 27 feet and displacing approximately 1,500 tons surfaced, nearly 2,000 tons submerged. The design incorporated lessons learned from earlier submarine classes, particularly regarding habitability during extended patrols, surface speed for repositioning between patrol areas, and most critically, weapons capacity that would prove decisive in the submarine and campaign against Japanese maritime commerce. The torpedo rooms, both forward and aft, defined the Gato-Class submarine's reason for existence. The forward torpedo room contained 6 21-inch diameter torpedo tubes arranged in 2 rows, 3 tubes per row, with the upper tubes positioned slightly higher than the lower tubes to permit simultaneous loading and firing. The after torpedo room contained 4 additional 21-inch tubes arranged similarly. This gave each Gato-Class submarine 10 torpedo tubes total, a formidable armament by any standard. But tube count told only part of the story. The revolutionary aspect of the Gato-Class design, the feature that Japanese naval planners failed to adequately appreciate until American submarines began demonstrating it operationally, concerned not how many tubes the submarines carried, but rather how many reload torpedoes each vessel could store internally for extended combat operations, far from any support facilities. American submarine designers had confronted a fundamental challenge when developing the Gato-Class specifications during the late 1930s. Pacific Ocean distance between potential patrol areas and friendly bases would be enormous, often exceeding 5,000 miles. Submarines would need to transit thousands of miles to reach their assigned patrol zones, conduct offensive operations for weeks, then transit thousands of miles back to base for replenishment. The longer a submarine could remain on station conducting combat operations, the more effective it would be strategically. This meant maximizing weapons loadout within the constraints of the submarine's internal volume, weight distribution requirements, and the physical limitations of handling 21-inch torpedoes, weighing approximately 3,000 pounds each in the confined spaces of a submarine's interior. The solution American designers developed would fundamentally shape the Pacific submarine campaign's character and effectiveness. Each Gato-Class submarine could carry 24 Mark 14 or Mark 18 torpedoes. 14 reload torpedoes stored in the forward torpedo room beyond the 6 loaded in tubes, and 4 reload torpedoes in the after torpedo room beyond the 4 loaded in tubes. This weapons capacity exceeded that of German Type 7 U-boats, which typically carried 14 torpedoes total, and Japanese fleet submarines of comparable displacement, which generally carried 17 to 20 torpedoes, depending on specific class and configuration. The Imperial Japanese Navy had developed its submarine doctrine around fundamentally different operational concepts and strategic priorities compared to American submarine force thinking. Japanese submarines were designed primarily for fleet actions, serving as scouts for the main battle fleet and conducting torpedo attacks against enemy warships during major surface engagements that Japanese planners expected would decide the Pacific War's outcome. This doctrinal emphasis reflected the influence of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and other senior officers who had studied Alfred Thayer Mahan's theories about decisive battle and believed that destroying the American battle fleet in a single massive engagement would force the United States to negotiate a settlement favorable to Japanese territorial ambitions in Asia and the Pacific. Japanese submarine designs reflected these operational priorities through their engineering characteristics and capabilities. Vessels like the I-class fleet submarines emphasized high surface speed exceeding 20 knots to keep pace with surface battle fleets, long range for extended scouting missions, and the ability to operate aircraft for reconnaissance purposes. Some Japanese submarines carried small floatplanes in watertight hangars, launching them via catapult to extend visual search radius beyond what the submarine's periscope could observe. These capabilities came at the cost of other characteristics that American designers prioritized, including weapons capacity, underwater maneuverability, and the ability to conduct prolonged submerged operations in enemy-controlled waters. Japanese naval intelligence officers analyzing American submarine capabilities during the late 1930s and early 1940s possessed incomplete and sometimes inaccurate information about Gato-Class specifications. Intelligence estimates suggested American fleet submarines carried approximately 16 to 18 torpedoes, a reasonable assumption based on extrapolation from earlier American submarine classes and comparison with other nations' submarine designs. Japanese planners understood that American submarines would likely conduct commerce raiding against Japanese merchant shipping, attempting to interdict the sea lanes connecting Japan's home islands with conquered territories in Southeast Asia, the Netherlands East Indies, and the Pacific Islands. However, they significantly underestimated how persistently and effectively American submarines could sustain offensive operations in Japanese-controlled waters, remaining on patrol for extended periods while continuing to attack Japanese shipping with torpedoes that seemed inexhaustible. The underestimation stemmed partly from doctrinal assumptions about how submarine warfare should be conducted according to Japanese naval thinking. Japanese submarine doctrine did not emphasize extended independent patrols against merchant shipping, viewing such operations as strategically secondary to fleet actions against enemy warships. Japanese submarines operating against American commerce during the war's early months achieved only modest results, sinking relatively few merchant vessels despite having opportunities to attack shipping along the American west coast and around Hawaii. This operational pattern reflected doctrinal priorities and training that emphasized warship targets over merchant vessels, even when the latter presented easier and more numerous targets. Additionally, Japanese naval planners failed to fully appreciate the strategic implications of America's industrial capacity and shipbuilding capability. The United States possessed the world's largest and most sophisticated shipbuilding industry, capable of constructing submarines, surface warships, and merchant vessels simultaneously at rates that seemed impossible to Japanese observers accustomed to Japan's more limited industrial base. American shipyards would eventually construct over 200 submarines during World War II, including the 77 Gato-Class boats, the later Ballao-Class with strengthened hulls for deeper diving, and the Tench-Class incorporating further refinements. This production scale allowed the American submarine force to maintain continuous pressure on Japanese shipping lanes, while simultaneously replacing losses and expanding force strength throughout the war. The Mark 14 torpedo, which equipped American submarines during the war's early years, measured 20 feet 6 inches in length, 21 inches in diameter, and weighed 3,250 pounds, including its 663-pound Torpex high-explosive warhead. The weapon used a steam turbine propulsion system powered by compressed air and alcohol fuel, generating approximately 27,000 shaft horsepower to drive the torpedo through water at approximately 46 knots for a maximum range of 4,500 yards, or at lower speeds for extended range exceeding 9,000 yards at 31 knots. The torpedo's sophisticated gyroscope system allowed it to be fired at angles relative to the target's bearing, with the gyroscope automatically adjusting the torpedo's course after leaving the tube to intercept the target at the calculated point. Storing 24 of these massive weapons inside a submarine's pressure hull required careful engineering and meticulous attention to weight distribution, structural reinforcement, and crew safety. The forward torpedo room, located in the submarine's bow, served simultaneously as weapons storage, torpedo launching station, and sleeping quarters for approximately 20 crew members who lived among the reload torpedoes, stored in racks along the compartment sides and overhead. Torpedo men slept in bunks mounted between and above the torpedoes, their rest interrupted regularly by the need to reload tubes after firing. The compartment smelled of oil, metal, and the close quarters inhabited by men who showered infrequently during war patrols lasting 2 months or longer. Loading a torpedo into a tube required coordinated effort by the torpedo room crew, working in confined space with limited room for error. The 3,000-pound torpedo had to be carefully extracted from its storage rack using a chain hoist system, aligned precisely with the tube's breech door, and pushed into the tube using mechanical assistance and careful manual guidance. The process demanded physical strength, technical skill, and courage, particularly when conducted during combat with the submarine maneuvering violently and depth charges exploding nearby, sending shock waves through the hull that could cause improperly secured torpedoes to shift dangerously. The after torpedo room, located in the submarine's stern, presented additional challenges due to its smaller size and the presence of the submarine's steering and diving plane controls nearby. The 4 tubes in this compartment provided tactical flexibility, allowing submarines to fire at targets astern during evasive maneuvers, or to attack multiple targets simultaneously using both forward and after tubes. However, the after torpedo room's cramped quarters made torpedo handling even more difficult than in the forward room, and reload times typically exceeded those achieved forward. American submarine commanders quickly learned to maximize their 24 torpedo loadouts' combat effectiveness through careful tactical planning and aggressive patrol conduct. Unlike surface ships that could return to port for rearming relatively quickly, submarines on war patrol had only the torpedoes they carried when leaving base. Once these weapons were expended, the submarine's offensive capability ceased entirely, forcing return to base regardless of remaining patrol time or target opportunities. The ability to carry 24 torpedoes meant submarines could sustain offensive operations approximately 50% longer than if they carried only 16 torpedoes, translating directly into increased strategic effectiveness and higher Japanese shipping loss per patrol. The first American submarine war patrols into Japanese-controlled waters began within weeks of Pearl Harbor, as boats like USS Gudgeon, USS Plunger, and USS Pollack departed from Pearl Harbor and other bases to carry the war directly to Japan's maritime lifelines. These early patrols revealed both the Gato-Class submarines' capabilities and the severe deficiencies in American torpedo performance that would plague the submarine force throughout 1942 and into 1943. Commanders reported firing torpedoes at point-blank range against stationary or slow-moving targets, only to watch the weapons pass harmlessly beneath enemy hulls or strike targets without detonating. The Mark 14 torpedo suffered from multiple design flaws, including a magnetic exploder that detonated prematurely or failed to detonate at all, a contact exploder that failed when striking targets at perpendicular angles, and a tendency to run deeper than set depth, causing torpedoes to pass beneath targets. Despite these weapon deficiencies, American submarines began sinking Japanese merchant vessels at an increasing rate as commanders learned to work around torpedo problems through point-blank attacks, shallow depth settings, and pure persistence. Japanese merchant captains and naval escort commanders initially dismissed submarine attacks as isolated incidents of annoying but manageable threats to shipping that could be countered through standard anti-submarine measures including zigzagging, escorts, and routing adjustments. The systematic nature of American submarine operations, and particularly the combat persistence individual submarines, demonstrated through multiple attacks during single patrols, became apparent only gradually as Japanese shipping losses accumulated and patterns emerged from attack reports. Lieutenant Commander Howard Gilmore commanded USS Growler, SS-215, a Gato-Class submarine that departed Brisbane, Australia, on January 10, 1943, for its fourth war patrol in the South China Sea. Growler carried its full complement of 24 torpedoes, a load that weighed approximately 78,000 pounds and required careful distribution throughout the boat to maintain proper trim and diving characteristics. The submarine proceeded northward through dangerous waters, penetrating deep into areas Japanese planners considered relatively secure, approaching major shipping routes connecting Singapore, French Indochina, and the Philippines with Japan's home islands. On January 16th, Growler detected a convoy consisting of 3 cargo ships, escorted by 2 destroyers proceeding westward towards Singapore. Gilmore maneuvered into attack position, firing 4 torpedoes from the forward tubes at the largest merchantman, a 7,000-ton cargo vessel loaded with war materials. 2 torpedoes struck the target, breaking the ship's back and causing it to sink within minutes. The escorts immediately began a counterattack, forcing Growler deep while depth charges exploded nearby, their concussive force rattling equipment and testing crew nerves. After evading the escorts through careful maneuvering and silent running, Growler surfaced after dark to recharge batteries and reload the 4 expended torpedo tubes from the forward room's reload racks. Over the following 3 weeks, Growler conducted 7 more attacks against Japanese shipping, expending additional torpedoes with each engagement. Gilmore demonstrated the tactical flexibility that 24 torpedoes provided, firing single torpedoes at smaller targets to conserve weapons, launching full spreads of 4 or 6 torpedoes at larger merchantmen or warships, and using aftertubes to attack targets during evasive maneuvers. By early February, Growler had sunk 6 confirmed Japanese vessels, totaling approximately 35,000 tons, damaged 2 others, and still retained 4 torpedoes for the transit back to Australia. The patrol demonstrated exactly what Japanese naval planners had failed to anticipate: a single American submarine penetrating Japanese-controlled waters, remaining on station for weeks despite counterattacks and evasion attempts, and conducting multiple successful attacks that inflicted substantial losses on Japanese shipping. Japanese merchant marine officers and naval intelligence analysts examining the pattern of attacks in the South China Sea during January and early February 1943 faced a troubling puzzle. Multiple ships had been torpedoed in the same general operating area over a 3-week period, suggesting either numerous American submarines operating simultaneously in concentrated areas or individual submarines possessing far greater weapons capacity than intelligence estimates suggested. The former explanation seemed unlikely given the distances involved and the resources required to maintain multiple submarines on station simultaneously. The latter explanation contradicted established intelligence assessments about American submarine capabilities and raised disturbing questions about how long American submarines could sustain offensive operations without returning to base for weapons replenishment. The reality of Gato-Class operational endurance exceeded Japanese expectations through multiple dimensions beyond simple torpedo capacity. American submarines could remain at sea for approximately 75 days, limited primarily by food storage capacity rather than fuel or weapons. The boats carried sufficient diesel fuel for cruising ranges exceeding 11,000 nautical miles at economical surface speeds, far exceeding the distances required for patrols throughout the Pacific. Fresh water distilled from seawater using shipboard evaporators provided drinking water and limited washing water for the crew of approximately 80 officers and enlisted men. Food storage presented the primary limitation, as cramped submarine interiors offered limited refrigeration and dry storage space for provisions needed to feed 80 men for more than 2 months. Submarine crews during the war's early months subsisted on monotonous diets, dominated by canned goods, dehydrated vegetables, powdered eggs, and other preserved foods that could withstand months of storage in tropical heat and high humidity. Fresh food loaded at the patrol's beginning, including bread, vegetables, and occasionally meat, spoiled within days despite refrigeration, leaving crews dependent on preserved rations that grew increasingly unpalatable as patrols extended. The psychological impact of poor food quality compounded the stress of combat operations, depth charge attacks, and the claustrophobic conditions aboard submarines, where 80 men shared spaces smaller than most houses, with no privacy, limited fresh air, and constant proximity to danger. Torpedo reload procedures during war patrols required careful planning and physical effort under conditions that ranged from merely difficult to genuinely dangerous. After firing torpedoes during an attack, the submarine would typically evade, counterattacking escorts, surface after dark when visual detection risk decreased, and begin the laborious process of reloading empty tubes from the reload racks. The forward torpedo room crew would extract a 3,000-pound torpedo from its storage position using the overhead chain hoist, carefully aligning the weapon with the empty tube while the submarine rolled gently in the surface swell. The torpedo would be pushed into the tube using a combination of mechanical assistance and manual effort. The breech door closed and secured, and the tube flooded in preparation for the next attack. This process repeated for each expended tube, with experienced crews requiring approximately 30 minutes per torpedo under ideal conditions. Combat conditions, darkness, rough seas, or mechanical difficulties could extend reload times significantly. Throughout the reload evolution, the submarine remained vulnerable on the surface, unable to dive quickly with torpedo loading in progress, and the forward or after hatches open to provide ventilation and emergency egress for the torpedo room crews. The risk calculation balanced tactical necessity against vulnerability, gambling that radar watch and lookouts would provide sufficient warning of approaching threats to secure the torpedo loading operation and dive before enemy forces closed to attack range. Japanese naval force gradually recognized the persistent threat American submarines posed to maritime commerce as shipping loss accumulated throughout 1942 and into 1943. Monthly sinkings increased steadily despite Japanese implementation of convoy systems, routing adjustments, and dedicated anti-submarine patrols. Analysis of attack patterns revealed that American submarines were conducting multiple attacks during individual patrols, remaining in Japanese-controlled waters for weeks, and demonstrating weapons capacity that significantly exceeded initial intelligence estimates. Some, Japanese, merchant captains reported being attacked by submarines that had already sunk other vessels in the area days or weeks earlier, suggesting individual boats carried sufficient torpedoes to conduct extended offensive campaigns rather than isolated attacks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic implications became increasingly clear to Japanese naval planners as American submarine operations intensified. Japan's war economy depended absolutely on maritime commerce, connecting the resource-rich conquered territories in Southeast Asia and the Netherlands East Indies, with industrial centers in Japan's home islands. Oil from the East Indies, rice from Southeast Asia, minerals from throughout the co-prosperity sphere, and manufactured goods from Japan traveled aboard merchant vessels along sea lanes that stretched thousands of miles through waters American submarines now patrolled with devastating effectiveness. Each merchantman sunk represented not only lost cargo and crew, but also diminished capacity to sustain military operations, supply forward bases, and maintain the civilian economy supporting the war effort. Commander Dudley Morton assumed command of USS Wahoo, SS-238, in August 1942 and transformed the submarine through aggressive leadership and tactical innovations that maximized the boat's 24 torpedo capacity. Morton developed a partnership with Executive Officer Richard O'Kane, who served as Assistant Approach Officer and coordinated attacks with unprecedented precision. Together, they pioneered tactics that emphasized aggressive surface attacks when conditions permitted, rapid-fire torpedo spreads that overwhelmed target evasion attempts, and relentless pursuit of convoy targets that conventional submarine doctrine might have avoided as too dangerous or well-defended. Wahoo's Third War Patrol, under Morton's command, conducted in January 1943 in the waters around New Guinea, demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of aggressive tactics combined with maximum weapons loadout. The patrol began with relatively routine encounters against small cargo vessels and fishing boats. Then, on January 24th, Wahoo detected a large Japanese convoy consisting of 2 troop transports escorted by destroyers, proceeding toward New Guinea with reinforcements for Japanese garrison forces fighting against Allied advances. Morton decided to attack despite the heavy escort, maneuvering Wahoo into position and firing a spread of torpedoes at the larger transport. The initial attack damaged one transport, prompting the escorts to counterattack while the convoy attempted to evade. Morton, rather than breaking off to avoid the escorts as standard doctrine suggested, instead pursued the damaged convoy aggressively, conducting repeated attacks over the following hours. Wahoo fired torpedo after torpedo, reloading tubes as quickly as the torpedo room crews could manage, attacking both surfaced and submerged, evading escort counterattacks through violent maneuvers and depth excursions, and then returning to press additional attacks. The engagement consumed most of Wahoo's torpedo load, but resulted in the sinking of both transports, with approximately 1,200 Japanese soldiers aboard, one of the submarine force's most devastating single patrol achievements to that point in the war. Japanese survivors rescued from the sunken transports reported their convoy had been attacked repeatedly by what they believed were multiple submarines, coordinating their attacks, unable to comprehend how a single submarine could sustain such prolonged offensive action while expending what seemed an inexhaustible supply of torpedoes. This misperception reflected the fundamental gap between Japanese expectations of submarine combat persistence and the operational reality that Gato-Class boats demonstrated through their superior weapons capacity and aggressive American submarine commanders' tactical employment. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant marine crews and naval personnel responsible for escort duties proved significant as submarine attacks intensified throughout 1943. Sailing through waters American submarines patrolled meant accepting substantial risk of attack, with limited confidence that escorts could provide adequate protection. Merchantmen travelled in convoy when possible, zigzagged constantly to complicate submarine attack solutions, maintained blacked-out conditions at night, and posted vigilant lookouts scanning for periscopes or surfaced submarines. Despite these precautions, American submarines continued sinking Japanese shipping at accelerating rates, demonstrating combat persistence that seemed impossible to counter effectively, given the vast ocean areas requiring protection and the limited anti-submarine forces Japan could allocate to escort duties. The cumulative effect of American submarine operations against Japanese merchant shipping reached devastating proportions by 1944, and improved torpedoes finally resolved the Mark 14's chronic deficiencies, and American submarine numbers increased through continuous construction programs. Japanese merchant marine loss accelerated dramatically, with hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping sunk monthly by submarines that operated with near impunity throughout waters Japan had considered relatively secure earlier in the war. The Gato-Class submarines, with their 24 torpedo capacity and extended patrol endurance, formed the backbone of this submarine offensive that systematically strangled Japan's maritime commerce and severed the economic connections between resource areas and industrial centers. Statistical analysis of Japanese shipping loss reveals the submarine campaign's strategic impact with stark clarity. Entered the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping, a fleet barely adequate for peacetime commerce requirements and grossly insufficient for simultaneously supporting military operations across the vast Pacific theater while maintaining civilian economy. American submarines sank approximately 5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping during the war, approximately 85% of Japan's total merchant marine loss from all causes. This catastrophic attrition destroyed Japan's ability to transport oil from the East Indies, rice from Southeast Asia, and raw materials from throughout the co-prosperity sphere, creating shortages that crippled both military operations and civilian industries by war's end. The Gato-Class submarine's 24 torpedo capacity contributed directly to these losses by enabling prolonged patrols during which individual submarines could attack multiple targets before exhausting their weapons and returning to base. Patrol reports from successful commanders like Richard O'Kane, who later commanded USS Tang, Eugene Fluckey aboard USS Barb, and Samuel Dealey commanding USS Harder, document patrols, during which these boats expended their entire torpedo loads against Japanese shipping, sinking multiple vessels during single patrols, and achieving tonnage totals that individually exceeded the capacity of the ships they destroyed. The weapons capacity Japanese intelligence had underestimated proved strategically decisive when multiplied across hundreds of war patrols conducted by dozens of submarines operating simultaneously throughout the Pacific. Japanese attempts to counter the submarine threat through convoy systems, routing changes, and dedicated anti-submarine forces achieved only limited success against opponents who possessed superior equipment, better training, and operational advantages, including excellent intelligence derived from breaking Japanese naval codes. American submarines often received detailed information about Japanese convoy routes, schedules, and composition, allowing them to position themselves optimally for attacks rather than relying on random patrol encounters. This intelligence advantage, combined with material superiority in submarine design and weapons capacity, created operational asymmetry that Japanese forces proved unable to overcome despite recognizing the submarine threat's severity. The human cost of the submarine campaign extended far beyond simple tonnage statistics. Approximately 122,000 Japanese merchant mariners died during the war, many of them killed when American submarines sank their ships. These civilian sailors, serving aboard cargo vessels and tankers that constituted legitimate military targets under international law, faced risks comparable to combat soldiers, sailing through submarine-infested waters with minimal protection and limited hope of rescue if their vessels were torpedoed. Japanese merchant marine recruitment became increasingly difficult as the war progressed and losses mounted, forcing the conscription of increasingly young and poorly trained crews who understood intellectually that sailing aboard merchantmen meant accepting substantial probability of violent death. American submarine crews paid their own, a significant price for prosecuting the campaign against Japanese shipping. The United States submarine force suffered the highest casualty rate of any American military service during World War II, with 52 submarines lost to enemy action, accidents, and unknown causes, taking approximately 3,600 officers and men to their deaths. These losses represented approximately 22% of all submarines deployed and approximately 16% of submarine force personnel, casualty rates that exceeded those suffered by any other branch of American military service, including infantry divisions that fought in the war's bloodiest campaigns. The men who manned Gato-Class submarines understood the risks intimately, living in steel tubes that could become mass tombs. If depth charges ruptured the pressure hull or enemy gunfire caught them surfaced and unable to dive. USS Growler, the submarine that had demonstrated such devastating effectiveness during its fourth war patrol under Howard Gilmore, met its end during its 11th patrol on February 7, 1943. While conducting a surface attack against a Japanese convoy off New Britain, Growler collided with a Japanese gunboat in darkness, the grinding impact crushing the submarine's bow structure and seriously injuring crew members in the forward torpedo room. Commander Gilmore, wounded on the bridge during the collision and facing the choice between attempting to reach the bridge hatch before diving or ordering an immediate dive that would save his crew but leave him on the surface, made the decision that would earn him a posthumous Medal of Honor. His final order, relayed through the intercom to the control room, consisted of 3 words that every submariner understands. Take her down. Growler dove with Gilmore still on the bridge, the wounded commander disappearing beneath the waves as the submarine submerged to escape the damaged gunboat and other convoy escorts. The submarine survived the encounter and returned to Australia with severe bow damage, later receiving repairs and modifications before returning to combat operations. Gilmore's sacrifice exemplified the courage submarine warfare demanded. The split-second decisions commanders faced, and the understanding that the submarine and crew's survival took absolute priority over individual lives, including the captain's. His decision saved approximately 80 men who would have died had Growler remained on the surface, attempting to recover the bridge crew while under fire. USS Wahoo, Morton's aggressively commanded submarine that had achieved such devastating success against Japanese shipping, disappeared during its 7th war patrol in October 1943. The submarine had been assigned a patrol area in the Sea of Japan, penetrating through the heavily defended La Pérouse Strait to attack shipping in waters Japanese forces considered relatively safe from American submarine operations. Wahoo sank several vessels during the patrol before Japanese forces detected and attacked the submarine in the shallow waters of the Sea of Japan. The exact circumstances of Wahoo's loss remained unclear until Japanese records examined after the war revealed that anti-submarine aircraft had attacked and sunk an American submarine in Wahoo's operating area on October 11th, 1943, killing Morton and the entire 80-man crew. The loss of these submarines and their skilled crews represented the price America paid for prosecuting the submarine campaign that ultimately proved strategically decisive in defeating Japan. Each lost boat took with it not only 80 men, but also the accumulated combat experience, tactical knowledge, and operational expertise those crews had developed through previous patrols. The submarine force could replace lost boats through continuous construction, new Gato-Class submarines sliding down building ways every few weeks during peak production periods. Replacing the experienced crews proved far more difficult, requiring extensive training programs that converted civilian recruits into qualified submariner capable of operating complex submarines under combat conditions. Japanese naval force achieved occasional successes against American submarines through persistence, improved tactics, and the deployment of better anti-submarine weapons, including more effective depth charges and ahead-throwing weapons that allowed escorts to attack submerged submarines without losing sonar contact. However, these tactical improvements could not overcome the fundamental numerical and material advantages American submarines possessed, particularly the weapons capacity that allowed prolonged combat operations far from supporting bases. Japanese merchant shipping loss continued accelerating throughout 1944, despite improved anti-submarine measures, reaching levels that comprehensively disrupted Japan's war economy and created shortages of critical materials, including oil, which became so scarce that major naval units remained in port to conserve fuel. The strategic impact extended beyond immediate shipping loss to affect Japanese military operations throughout the Pacific theater. Inability to transport sufficient troops and supplies to forward bases meant Japanese garrison fought Allied advances without adequate reinforcement or resupply. Island base that might have been reinforced to resist Allied invasions instead fell with minimal resistance because submarines had sunk the transports carrying reinforcement troops and supplies. The submarine campaign thus contributed directly to American victories in campaigns across the Pacific by ensuring Japanese forces fought at numerical and material disadvantage, unable to concentrate sufficient combat power to contest Allied operations effectively. By war's end in August 1945, American submarines had fundamentally transformed the Pacific theater's strategic situation through systematic destruction of Japanese merchant shipping. Japan's economy, utterly dependent on imported raw materials and resources from conquered territories, collapsed under the combined pressure of submarine warfare and strategic bombing. Civilian population centers faced severe shortage of food, fuel, and basic commodities, as merchant shipping loss prevented adequate imports. Industrial production declined precipitously, as factories lacked raw materials, particularly oil and metals essential for manufacturing weapons and ammunition. The home islands faced genuine starvation, as rice imports from Southeast Asia ceased due to shipping losses and Allied advances that recaptured rice-producing territories. The Gato-Class submarine's 24 torpedo capacity, the technical characteristic Japanese intelligence had underestimated in 1941 and 42, proved strategically decisive when employed by aggressive commanders who understood how to maximize their submarines' capabilities. The ability to conduct multiple attacks during single patrols, remaining on station for weeks while continuing to sink Japanese shipping, created combat persistence that Japanese anti-submarine forces could not effectively counter. Each torpedo fired represented a potential ship sunk, cargo lost, crew killed, and diminished capacity to sustain military operations. Multiplied across hundreds of patrols conducted by dozens of submarines over nearly 4 years of intensive combat operations, these individual torpedo attacks accumulated into strategic effect that contributed substantially to Japan's defeat. The submarine campaign's success vindicated American submarine design philosophy that prioritized weapons capacity, patrol endurance, and habitability over the pure performance characteristics that Japanese designers emphasized. Gato-Class submarines were not the fastest submarines, did not dive deepest, and lacked some sophisticated features that Japanese fleet submarines incorporated. However, they could carry 24 torpedoes, remain at sea for 75 days, transit 11,000 miles on internal fuel, and operate effectively in the vast Pacific Ocean distances that characterized the theater. These capabilities, dismissed as secondary by Japanese planners who expected decisive fleet battles to determine the war's outcome, instead proved strategically essential when submarine warfare against commerce became the primary naval campaign. The memory of American submarine operations during World War II remains preserved through patrol reports, personal accounts, official histories, and the memorials honoring the 52 boats and 3,600 men lost during the campaign. Surviving Gato-Class submarines serve as museum ships at locations across the United States, including USS Drum in Mobile, Alabama, USS Silversides in Muskegon, Michigan, and USS Bowfin in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Visitors can walk through these preserved submarines, examining the cramped quarters where crews lived for months at a time, seeing the torpedo rooms where 3,000-pound weapons were stored and loaded, and contemplating the courage required to take these steel tubes into combat against an enemy that sought to destroy them through depth charges, gunfire, and aerial attack. The story of how Gato-Class submarines carried 24 torpedoes on patrol and the strategic impact this capability enabled illustrates how technical characteristics that seem mundane in peacetime engineering discussions can determine strategic outcomes during war. Japanese naval planners who underestimated American submarine weapons capacity in 1941 made an assessment error that contributed directly to Japan's defeat, as those additional torpedoes translated into additional ships sunk, additional resources lost, and additional damage inflicted on an economy that could not sustain the losses submarine warfare imposed. The submarines that departed American bases carrying those 24 torpedoes returned having expended them against Japanese shipping, patrol after patrol, year after year, until Japanese merchant marine effectively ceased to exist as functioning organization capable of sustaining Japan's war effort or civilian economy. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.